So here we are. Let's do it a little bit differently. Let's start with the narrative. Let's look at what actually goes on in this little part of the Bible that we're going to look at this afternoon. It's the account of Thomas. If you've been around the church for any kind of time, maybe you've grown up in the church, you'll have heard him talked about as doubting Thomas. That's because doubt is mentioned in there. But I think I want to just change the narrative a little bit around that. But let's look at what happens. In this account, John's account, Jesus has been raised from the dead. He appears to Mary Magdalene, then to the other disciples, excluding Thomas. Thomas returns and he comes back to that group of disciples. Verse 25, they say to him, "We've seen the Lord." And Thomas doesn't believe. He says to them, "Unless I can have a true embodied experience, an existential experience, something about my existence as a human being. Unless I can have that, I won't believe. Let me define for you," Thomas says to the disciples, "what it is, the kind of reality that needs to exist for me to actually believe." And he says this in verse 25, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." That's Thomas's response. Next verse, a week later. Just think about that for a minute. They've had this conversation, then 7 days pass. What I suspect happens during that time for Thomas is his mind is reinforced, his thinking is reinforced that it is a right thing for me not to have believed. What does believing do for Thomas? I think it exposes him. It exposes him potentially to the greatest level of upset and experiential failure. He spent years walking with Jesus. If he says, "I'm going to believe this on the words of these disciples," I'm going to be let down so badly, I don't know whether I'll recover from that. And therefore, I'm going to set my criterion on what it is that will be the kind of benchmark for me to believe. A week later, the disciples are together again, and this time Thomas is with them, and Jesus appears and invites Thomas to place his finger in his hands and placed his hands in his side. Isn't it remarkable what Jesus does? We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. Remarkable what Jesus does. He invites Thomas to fulfill exactly the criteria that Thomas has laid down, that is what is necessary for Thomas to believe. And Thomas' response is this: "My Lord and my God." That's the story. That's the way it unfolds. It's really quite simple, isn't it? It takes place over 7 days. Thomas doesn't believe. Jesus appears a second time. He's invited to do what he requests is necessary for him to believe. And when that happens, his response is to say, "My Lord and my God." I'm going to look at just 3 things which I think speak incredibly powerfully to our generation. Rara avis in terris nigroc similima signo. Let me just say that to you. I think I've probably mispronounced at least one of those Latin words. But what it means is this: a bird as rare upon the earth as a black swan. That's what the Romans used to say. The Latin phrase used to say, they used to capture this idea, something as rare as a black swan. They said that because they knew, as far as they were concerned, that black swans didn't exist. So it's a bit like us saying it's about as rare as hen's teeth. We're slightly more accurate because we know that hens don't have teeth. However, Dutch mariners, many centuries later, finally arrived in Australia, and they discovered black swans. You might not be excited by that. If you were a bird watcher in that time in history, your mind would have been blown. Your ornithological world would have been turned upside down. But what it has generated is the idea of a black swan theory. And the black swan theory is this: we can wholeheartedly believe one thing. We can commit ourselves to believing one thing, but one occurrence that disrupts that belief changes everything. It's the black swan theory. It's the idea that you can hold on to one truth, and you can hold it really deeply, but all it takes is for one event to change that truth, and you cannot go back. You can no longer go back and not believe in black swans when there's a black swan in front of you. I guessed the truth of black swans, knowing the way that information spread around the world when Dutch mariners were first arriving in Australia. I reckon the truth about black swans probably took a good few decades to actually permeate everybody, so that everybody truly believed in black swans. That's the way it worked back then. You'd get some Dutch sailors come back, and they'd be sat in port, and they'd say, "You never believe what I saw while I was on my travels. I actually saw a black swan." And you think, okay, that could be too much rum, it could be scurvy, it could be all sorts of problems. And over time, what seemed incredulous becomes true. Why do we say that? Why is that incredibly important? I think in our day and age, and the whole of our series that we've been working through during this Easter time, is what is truth? What is it that is true? This event with Thomas, this situation that unfolds, and black swan theory speaks incredibly powerfully to our generation today. I think more than ever, we will believe things not when we're told them, not when we see pictures of them anymore, not when we see video of them anymore, not when we're persuaded by news articles or documentaries. We will increasingly reach a point as human beings where we will only believe the things that we can truly see with our eyes. That's the way it's going. That's an incredible situation. With all of our technology, we're now in a point where we fundamentally don't believe more things because of technology. We're in a situation now where more of us are probably going to reach that point in our lives where we say, I'll believe it when I can see it. That is exactly where Thomas was. It speaks into, I think, one of the notions of what it is for human beings to comprehend truth. Truth can be spoken to us, but there is a deeper knowing. There is something that we deeply know. There is something that moves something from an idea to truth when we actually see it, when we touch it, when we feel it. I think that is written into what is in the notion of what it is to be human. When we see something that is disrupting, that changes the whole of our previous history of understanding, but it is unrefutably in front of you, irrefutably in front of us, we have no choice but to change our view. I would argue that the resurrection of Jesus is the greatest black swan event in all of human history. There is nothing that has changed human understanding like the resurrection of Jesus. Nothing. There is nothing so great. Why is it so big? It changes our notion of what it is to be human in this way. We are opened up to the reality of human resurrection. That's one thing that changes. One of the things that Thomas was faced with as he is spoken to by the disciples who say, this Jesus, we've seen him, he's alive. And he says, I cannot believe it until I actually put my fingers in his hands, put my hand in his side, because what you're saying to me means that it must be possible for a human being to be raised from the dead. I just can't go with that. But in an instant, Thomas's black swan moment was when Jesus stood in front of him. And he knew that human resurrection was a true reality. The second thing that changes is his recognition of the true nature of Jesus. This idea of Jesus being somebody who I've walked alongside for a few years has been upended. His claim of divinity now has legitimacy beyond anything that I could have ever believed. What Thomas is faced with, I can now see that I might rise from the dead, and I can now see that Jesus is who he claims to be. The greatest black swan moment in human history. I think for you and me today, that is truth in a different way. A lot of what we've looked at over the past few weeks, they've been words that have been said by different people, where we've shown how the words that have been said argue truth in one way or another. This is different. This isn't argued from the point of words. It's argued from the point of physical presence. It's argued from the point of life. It's argued from a point where somebody who went into the grave and died has breathed again and is stood in front of Thomas. It's a completely different idea, and it is an essential idea for what we see as truth today. That's what truth is. The second thing I just want to look at is the impact that it has on Thomas. Verse 28, how does he respond to this? There is no record whatsoever that Thomas does what he is invited to do. He says, this is what I need to do. I need to put my finger in his hands. I need to put my hand in his side. Thomas is saying, I need to do that so that I know that it is truly the Jesus of Nazareth who was nailed to the cross. I need to see those wounds as I observed them, or as I was told about them, whichever it might be. I suspect probably observed them from a distance. I need to be able to touch them so that I know that that is the case. But look at what Jesus does. He doesn't condemn Thomas for that need. He graciously invites him to experience what he said he needed to believe. Because I think what is going on here is God, in all of his gracious mercy, is recognizing that human truth is not simply what is said, but it is what is seen, what is touched, and what is felt. It's what we experience. It's our existence. It's our human existence that Jesus, in his gracious mercy, is inviting Thomas to touch. I think Thomas is probably actually quite an analytical and rigorous kind of guy. If I'm going to believe it, I really need to see it. The amazing thing is, in Jesus' kindness, he invites him to do it, but the response of Thomas is this: my Lord and my God. He doesn't touch him, as far as we can see. He doesn't need to. He doesn't put his hand in his side, as far as we can see. He doesn't need to. In that moment, I can imagine. Can you imagine what it might have been like in that room when Jesus invited him? Can you imagine their eyes looking at each other, making eye contact? Jesus, I believe with all my heart, Jesus was looking at Thomas with the same kind of gracious, invitational concern and love that he was showing Thomas at that moment, as he showed Peter when he denied him. It's the same Jesus who is saying to Peter, I know you had to walk this pathway, but I am still with you. And Thomas, I know that you had to see this to believe, and I am still with you. And as Thomas looked into the face of Jesus, his world is transformed. It's changed forever. He is no longer the same person. What he thought he needed is no longer necessary. He knows that Jesus lives. Look at what he says, because it is so incredibly powerful. My Lord and my God. He does not say, Jesus, you have risen. I suspect for Thomas, this is the moment in his life when he truly understood who Jesus was. My Lord and my God. What's he expressing? Firstly, he's expressing for him personally, there is a newly assigned authority in his life. Every one of us have an authority in our lives. For most of us, it's ourselves. For most of us, it's ourselves. But in the words of Bob Dylan, we've all got to serve somebody. Mostly it's ourselves, but Thomas' moment changed. And there is a new authority because he describes Jesus now as his Lord. You are Lord over my life. That's the first thing we see. The second thing we see is this. He has a redefined and resolved divine relationship. Look at the words that he uses. My Lord and my God. The whole of the storyline of the Bible and our own personal experience is that we know that we have a crisis with the divine God of the creation of the world. We have a crisis. That is the storyline of the Bible. All of humanity is in crisis, and yet Thomas in this moment is able to say that you are my Lord and my God. That divine relationship in this moment has been restored. I suspect it's because Thomas knew as Jesus looked at him, that face of Jesus was an invitation to relationship from here on in. A redefined and resolved divine relationship. Thirdly, we see that he now has life purpose. Everything changes now. Everything changes. Where does Thomas end up? As far as we can see, according to tradition, Thomas died because of this event. In fact, as far as we can see, every single one of the disciples, with the exception of John, who uniquely died as an old man of natural causes, every one of the disciples died because they held on to this claim. Every one of them, Thomas included, died because they believed that who they saw in front of them was Jesus, the Jesus who had died, who was buried, who actually did rise again, who Thomas recognized now is the living God in front of me. And I will get to the point now where the whole of my life has a completely different purpose. A purpose so dramatic that I'll die for it. How remarkably different is that from a week earlier, where Thomas was on a journey, I think, and probably was for the next 7 days, of trying to work out what to do with his life. Because he's walked with this Jesus for 3 years, and now he's dead. I've walked with this Jesus. I thought I knew where my life was going, and now he's dead. I think the understanding that Thomas had before the death of Jesus was that Jesus was going to be the Messiah for his people in a way that would make sense to Thomas. But what became clear to Thomas was that the true Messiah that Jesus became was something more than he had ever understood before. And now he has a purpose that he's willing to die for. Why? He's got a newly assigned authority. He's got a redefined and resolved divine relationship. He's got an existential purpose. Why? Because he knows that there is eternal hope through resurrection. That's it. He knows that there is eternal hope through resurrection. Everything changes if we live again. Everything changes. It is the biggest claim of the Bible. That we might live again after dying. That we might rise again. And that is what Thomas leans into. That's the impact on him. What are the implications for us? Look at verse 29. Then Jesus told him, "Because you've seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." I think the argument is possibly for us something like this. Thomas, you are so blessed. You are blessed because you saw me. Because your life has been turned around. You're so blessed. I think Thomas is one of the most blessed of all of the disciples because he's turned around more than any of the others. I think that's part of the purpose, is somebody who really couldn't believe without seeing. Jesus is gracious enough to give him the very reasons to give him a foundation, and he says, "Come and do this," and he's transformed. But how incredibly blessed. But the reality is this: you don't need to have physically seen Jesus to be blessed in the same way. Blessed also are those who believe and haven't seen. That's the most incredible invitation for us this afternoon. How amazing is that for Thomas? You're blessed because you have seen me. And then Jesus comes along and says, every single person who believes in me, almost even though they haven't seen me, is as blessed in the same way. That's astounding. That is the invitation. It gives us a newly assigned authority. It gives us a redefined and resolved divine relationship. It gives us an existential purpose in life. It gives us eternal hope in resurrection. It gives us all of the things that were transformed in Thomas's life. It gives us those very things. And you say, well, can I believe that? I think what Jesus is saying in that is he's saying this: I understand that human experience has the necessity of physical truth. I get that. It's how we are. Jesus did not spiritually rise. Jesus was not some sort of phantom or spirit. Jesus was a physical, resurrected being who returned to heaven. And the invitation is this, that we can believe that through Thomas, because he saw it. Paul goes on to tell the Corinthians that this is the foundation of our truth. He essentially says this is our black swan. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then everything that we say, everything that we do is a complete and utter waste of time. I would say to you this afternoon, investigate that truth. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, go and have a great life. Somehow. Go and try to find a way. But you know that there is something deep down that is seeking truth in Jesus. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, it changes everything. And it simply cannot be ignored. That is truth.